Tonight we venture into dangerous territory, the shadows cast by your own light. 3 things haunt the well-intentioned projection self-sabotage and that compulsive need to be loved by people who wouldn't recognize authentic goodness if it knocked on their door with a psychology degree. Forget the just be yourself advice. Yourself has abandonment issues and a savior complex that's been running your life since you learned that being good meant being safe. You say you're emotionally available, but you flinch every time. Someone says they need to talk about something serious. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Dim the lights, adjust the volume, and make sure your people-pleasing instincts are in airplane mode. You're no longer in your bedroom. You're inside the mind of someone who thinks being nice is a personality trait and wonders why life keeps serving them chaos with a side of emotional exhaustion. The good news, your shadow wants to be integrated. The bad news, it brought receipts from every time you said "I'm fine" when you weren't, and it's ready to have that conversation you've been avoiding since childhood. This video is for those who are exhausted from carrying wounds disguised as strength, tired of being the therapist in every relationship, while your own inner child sits in the corner with trust issues and a collection of unread self-help books. If you've ever wondered why your goodness seems to attract chaos instead of peace, why your empathy feels more like a curse than a gift, and why being spiritual sometimes feels like wearing a costume that's 3 sizes too small, this is your mirror. As Carl Jung once observed, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular. Tonight, we're choosing the disagreeable path not because we enjoy suffering, but because we're tired of the alternative, a life lived in the shadows of our own unexplored depths. The first shadow that goodness casts is the most insidious becomes a frequency dampener, a spiritual anesthetic that numbs you to your own authentic power. When you've spent years being the good one, the reliable one, the one who never causes problems, you've unknowingly created an energetic signature that says, "Use me, I won't object." This isn't kindness. This is fear wearing a halo. Your childhood taught you that love was conditional on your compliance. Every time you received attention for being quiet, helpful, or undemanding, your nervous system learned that your worth was tied to your willingness to disappear. The adults around you, struggling with their own unintegrated shadows, unconsciously rewarded you for carrying their disowned anger, sadness, and disappointment. You became a vessel for everyone else's emotional refuse, and you called it being good. But here's what nobody told you: that version of goodness is actually a sophisticated defense mechanism. It's your psyche's way of ensuring survival in an environment where authenticity felt dangerous. The child who learned that crying brought punishment, that anger brought abandonment, that needs brought inconvenience, develops into an adult who mistakes self-erasure for virtue. This creates what Jung called a compensation, an unconscious counterbalance to conscious attitudes. The more rigidly you identify with being good, the more your shadow accumulates power in the unconscious. Every unexpressed boundary, every swallowed truth, every moment you chose peace over honesty, feeds this growing darkness. It's not evil. It's life force that's been denied expression, and it will find a way out. The shadow doesn't emerge as obvious darkness. It's more subtle, more sophisticated. It shows up as passive aggression disguised as concern. It manifests as martyrdom dressed up as selflessness. It appears as depression that you call being deep, anxiety that you label sensitivity, and exhaustion that you frame as caring too much. Your goodness becomes a prison with invisible bars, and you become both the guard and the prisoner. Carl Jung understood that the psyche demands wholeness, not perfection. When you reject aspects of yourself in service of an idealized image, those rejected parts don't disappear. They go underground and begin orchestrating your life from the unconscious. The rage you never expressed becomes chronic illness. The boundaries you never set become attraction to people who have none. The authenticity you buried becomes an inexplicable emptiness that no amount of good deeds can fill. This is why your goodness might feel hollow sometimes, why your spiritual practices might feel like performance, why your relationships might feel like elaborate dances around truth. You're not connecting from your center. You're connecting from your wound, hoping that if you're good enough, consistent enough, selfless enough, you'll finally earn the love that should have been unconditional from the start. The second shadow, cast by unexamined goodness, is the way it warps your relationship with empathy. You've been told that feeling others' pain is a gift, a sign of spiritual advancement, evidence of your evolved consciousness. But what if your hyper-empathy is actually a trauma response? What if your ability to absorb others' emotions is less about spiritual sensitivity and more about a nervous system that never learned where you end and others begin? True empathy is conscious and boundaried. It's the ability to understand and share another's emotional state while maintaining your own center. What many people call empathy is actually emotional fusion, a compulsive merger with others' internal states that leaves you depleted, confused, and unable to access your own authentic feelings and desires. This fusion often begins in childhood with a parent or caregiver who was emotionally dysregulated. Perhaps you had a mother whose moods determined the emotional climate of the house, and you learned to monitor her internal weather system to ensure your own safety. Maybe you had a father whose anger was unpredictable, and you developed hypervigilance to emotional shifts as a survival mechanism. These early experiences taught your nervous system to prioritize others' emotional states over your own internal guidance. As an adult, this shows up as an inability to enter a room without immediately scanning for emotional distress, to fix an compulsive need to comfort others, even when they haven't asked for comfort, and a strange discomfort with your own emotional needs. You've become what psychologists call an emotional caretaker, someone who takes responsibility for others' feelings while neglecting their own emotional development. But here's the shadow. This compulsive empathy often masks unconscious control and manipulation. When you help someone who hasn't asked for help, you're not being kind. You're managing your own anxiety about their discomfort. When you absorb someone's emotions, you're not being spiritual. You're avoiding the work of developing your own emotional intelligence. When you sacrifice your needs to meet others, you're not being good. You're perpetuating codependent patterns that benefit no one. Jung called this phenomenon participation mystique, a psychological state where the boundary between self and other becomes blurred. In healthy development, we learn to differentiate between our internal experience and external reality. But trauma disrupts this process, leaving us psychologically merged with our environment in ways that feel spiritual but are actually developmental arrests. The hyper-empathic person often struggles with manifestation and personal power because their energy is constantly dispersed into others' emotional fields. They're trying to create from a fragmented state, attempting to build a life while simultaneously managing everyone else's psychological content. It's like trying to paint a masterpiece while constantly cleaning up other people's spills. The result is chaos disguised as charity. Recovery from this pattern requires what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming conscious of your unconscious content and integrating it into a mature, differentiated sense of self. This means learning to feel your own feelings without immediately seeking to fix, change, or absorb them. It means developing the capacity to witness others' pain without taking responsibility for resolving it. It means understanding that your value isn't determined by your usefulness to others' emotional regulation. The most profound realization in this process is understanding that your compulsive empathy might actually be preventing others from developing their own emotional resilience. When you consistently rescue people from the natural consequences of their choices, you're not helping them, you're enabling their emotional immaturity. True compassion sometimes looks like stepping back and allowing others to struggle, learn, and grow from their own experiences. This doesn't mean becoming callous or uncaring. It means developing what Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron calls tough love, a compassion that's strong enough to hold space for others' growth without interfering with their process. It means trusting that people are more resilient than your anxiety wants you to believe, and that your job is not to prevent all suffering, but to model what healthy emotional boundaries look like. The third shadow emerges when spirituality becomes a sophisticated form of spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts, practices, and language to avoid dealing with unresolved psychological material. You've probably encountered this in yourself or others, the person who talks about high vibrations, while treating service workers poorly, the individual who preaches about letting go while clinging to resentments from decades past, the spiritual seeker who can quote enlightened masters but can't have an honest conversation about their own emotional needs. This bypassing often develops as a response to childhood experiences where emotional expression was discouraged or punished. If you grew up in an environment where crying was seen as weakness, anger as dangerous, or sadness as inconvenient, you learn to transcend your emotions rather than process them. Spirituality becomes a way to rise above your humanity rather than integrate it. The shadow of spiritual bypassing is that it creates what psychologists call emotional stuntedness, areas of your psyche that remain undeveloped because they've been covered over with spiritual concepts rather than genuinely explored and integrated. You might have sophisticated understanding of consciousness and energy while still operating from the emotional maturity of a child when triggered. This shows up in relationships as an inability to engage in healthy conflict, a tendency to use spiritual language to avoid difficult conversations, and a pattern of attracting partners who are either equally emotionally immature or who are unconsciously drawn to fix your spiritual facade. You become what Jung might call a puer aeternus, an eternal child who uses spiritual concepts to avoid the messy work of psychological maturation. The integration of spirituality and psychology requires what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, being able to simultaneously honor your transcendent nature while fully engaging with your humanity. This means being able to meditate deeply and also have difficult conversations. It means being able to access states of peace and also feel your anger fully. It means being able to love unconditionally and also maintain healthy boundaries. True spiritual maturity looks like someone who can access expanded states of consciousness and also do their dishes, pay their bills, and show up consistently in relationships. It's the integration of the mystical and the mundane, the sacred and the psychological, the divine and the devastatingly human. The fourth shadow cast by unexamined goodness is what we might call the trauma of compliance, the way childhood conditioning creates adults who are energetically collapsed around their own power and agency. If you were raised in an environment where questioning authority was discouraged, where children were expected to be seen and not heard, where your natural exuberance was consistently dampened in service of adult convenience, you learned that survival required the suppression of your authentic self-expression. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, a psychological state where you've internalized the belief that you have no control over your circumstances, that your voice doesn't matter, that your needs are less important than maintaining the peace. This isn't conscious. It's a nervous system pattern that operates below the threshold of awareness, shaping your choices and responses in ways that keep you small. The compliant child becomes the accommodating adult who struggles with decision-making, has difficulty identifying their own preferences and experiences anxiety when asked to take up space or assert their needs. They've learned that love is earned through self-erasure, that safety comes from invisibility, that worth is determined by how little trouble they cause. This pattern is particularly insidious because it's often praised and rewarded by society. The compliant person is seen as mature, selfless, and spiritually advanced. They're the ones others turn to for support, the reliable friends who never cancel plans, the employees who work overtime without complaint. But beneath this facade of maturity is often a terrified child who never learned that they have the right to exist as they are. Jung understood that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, requires the integration of what he called the inferior function. This is the aspect of your personality that was most suppressed in childhood. The parts of yourself that you learned were unacceptable or dangerous. For the overly compliant person, this often involves reclaiming their right to take up space, to have opinions, to make choices that prioritize their own well-being. The integration process can be terrifying because it involves disappointing people who have become accustomed to your compliance. When you begin setting boundaries, saying no, or expressing preferences, the people around you might react with confusion, anger, or attempts to guilt you back into your old patterns. This is what Jung called the night sea journey, the difficult, passage through darkness that precedes psychological rebirth. But this passage is necessary because living in perpetual compliance creates what existential psychologists call existential anxiety, a deep, nameless dread that comes from living a life that isn't truly yours. You might achieve external success, maintain stable relationships, and appear to have everything together, but underneath is a persistent sense of emptiness, a feeling that you're living someone else's life while your authentic self remains buried and unexpressed. The path towards psychological freedom involves what Jung called active imagination, consciously engaging with the suppressed aspects of your psyche through dialogue, visualization, and creative expression. This might involve imagining conversations with the inner child who learned to be quiet, dialoguing with the inner rebel who was forced underground, or giving voice to the aspects of yourself that were deemed unacceptable. Recovery from compliance. Trauma also requires developing what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to experience discomfort without immediately seeking to fix change or escape it. The compliant person has often learned to manage others' discomfort as a way of avoiding their own, but healing requires turning toward your own emotional experience with curiosity and compassion. The fifth shadow emerges from what we might call vibrational fatigue, the exhaustion that comes from constantly maintaining an image that doesn't match your internal reality. When you've spent years being the positive one, the spiritual one, the one who has it all together, you create what psychologists call emotional labor, the ongoing work of managing not just your own emotional state, but the emotional climate of every room you enter. This labor is invisible and unacknowledged. Nobody sees the effort it takes to smile when you're grieving, to remain calm when you're furious, to offer support when you're depleted. Nobody recognizes the energy required to constantly monitor your impact on others, to modify your natural responses, to keep others comfortable, to carry the emotional weight of being everyone's safe space, while having nowhere to safely be yourself. The shadow of this pattern is that it creates what Jung called compensation, unconscious behaviors that balance out conscious attitudes. The person who is always positive might develop mysterious illnesses that force them to rest. The individual who never expresses anger might attract situations that provoke rage. The one who always gives might unconsciously create scenarios where they're forced to receive. These compensatory behaviors aren't character flaws, they're the psyche's attempt to restore balance. Your unconscious is trying to give you what your conscious mind has been denying. The depression that follows. Years of forced positivity isn't a failure of spiritual practice. It's your authentic self-demanding acknowledgement. The anxiety that accompanies perpetual people-pleasing isn't a personal weakness. It's your nervous system's way of saying that something is fundamentally wrong with this arrangement. Jung understood that the psyche has its own intelligence, its own way of seeking wholeness, even when our conscious mind is committed to patterns that fragment us. The symptoms that emerge from vibrational fatigue, the exhaustion, the resentment, the mysterious illnesses, the relationship problems, aren't problems to be fixed, but communications to be understood. The integration of this shadow requires what Jung called holding the tension, learning to experience conflicting emotions without immediately resolving them into a more comfortable narrative. This might mean acknowledging that you can love someone and also feel angry with them. It might involve recognizing that you can be grateful for your life and also grieve what you've lost. It might require accepting that you can be spiritual and still have very human reactions to very human problems. This process often involves what trauma therapists call titration, working with intense emotions in small, manageable doses rather than trying to process everything at once. The person who has spent years suppressing their authentic responses might need to start small, perhaps allowing themselves to feel irritated for 5 minutes without immediately shifting into gratitude or expressing a minor preference without apologizing. The goal isn't to become someone who vents every emotion or abandons all consideration for others. The goal is to develop what psychologists call emotional flexibility, the ability to respond authentically to situations rather than defaulting to learned patterns that prioritize others' comfort over your own integrity. The sixth shadow appears in what we might call performative goodness, the way that being good becomes a strategy for avoiding abandonment rather than an authentic expression of your values. When goodness is motivated by fear rather than love, it creates what attachment theorists call anxious attachment, a relational style characterized by hypervigilance to others' reactions and a compulsive need to prevent rejection through perfect behavior. This pattern often begins with childhood experiences of conditional love, receiving attention and affection only when you were behaving in ways that pleased your caregivers. Perhaps you had parents who were emotionally available when you were happy and successful, but withdrew when you were struggling or needy. Maybe you learned that love came with strings attached, that acceptance required maintaining an image of having it all together. The child who experiences conditional love develops what psychologists call false self, a personality organization that prioritizes others' expectations over authentic self-expression. This false self becomes highly skilled at reading social cues, anticipating others' needs, and modifying behavior to maintain approval. But it comes at the cost of developing a genuine sense of self. As an adult, this pattern shows up as an inability to relax in relationships, a constant mental calculation of whether you're being good enough, likable enough, valuable enough to warrant continued connection. You might find yourself exhausted by social interactions not because you're introverted, but because you're constantly performing rather than simply being. The shadow of performative goodness is that it attracts relationships based on utility rather than genuine connection. When you consistently present a version of yourself that prioritizes others' comfort over your authentic experience, you train people to relate to your false self rather than your true self. This creates what psychologists call pseudo-intimacy, relationships that feel close but lack genuine depth because they're based on performance rather than authentic disclosure. Jung understood that true intimacy requires what he called the courage to be disliked, the willingness to show up authentically even when it might disappoint others' expectations. This doesn't mean being deliberately difficult or inconsiderate, but it does mean prioritizing integrity over approval when the two come into conflict. The integration of this shadow involves what attachment theorists call earned security, the process of developing secure attachment patterns through conscious relationship work, even if you didn't receive secure attachment in childhood. This involves learning to tolerate the anxiety that comes with authentic self-expression, developing the capacity to repair relationships after conflict rather than avoiding conflict altogether, and gradually building trust in your own worthiness, independent of others' approval. This process often requires what therapists call reparenting, consciously providing yourself with the unconditional acceptance that you didn't receive in childhood. This might involve developing an internal voice that offers comfort during difficult emotions, learning to celebrate your authentic self-expression even when it's not perfectly polished, and gradually extending the same compassion to yourself that you've been offering to others. The seventh shadow emerges from what we might call the frequency of passivity, the way that being too peaceful can actually attract chaos into your life. This might seem counterintuitive, but Jung understood that the psyche operates according to the principle of compensation. When you consciously identify too strongly with one pole of experience, in this case peace and harmony, the unconscious begins to constellate its opposite. The person who says, "I just want peace," while consistently avoiding conflict, setting boundaries, or addressing problems directly, often discovers that peace remains elusive. Instead of the tranquility they seek, they attract drama, chaos, and people who seem determined to disturb their equilibrium. This isn't bad luck or poor manifestation. It's the psyche's attempt to restore balance. Peace without the capacity for healthy conflict isn't actually peace, it's suppression. True peace emerges from the ability to address problems directly, set clear boundaries, and engage in difficult conversations when necessary. It's what martial artists call peaceful warrior energy, calm and centered, but fully capable of appropriate response when needed. The shadow of excessive peacekeeping is that it often enables dysfunction in others. When you consistently avoid addressing problematic behavior, you're not maintaining peace, you're colluding with chaos. Your silence in the face of mistreatment teaches others that their behavior is acceptable. Your avoidance of difficult conversations allows problems to grow rather than being resolved. This pattern often develops from childhood experiences where conflict was associated with danger. Perhaps you grew up in a household where arguing led to violence, where raised voices meant someone was about to be hurt, where family harmony was maintained through everyone walking on eggshells around the most volatile member. In this environment, conflict avoidance was a survival strategy. But what served you in childhood might be sabotaging you in adulthood. The person who cannot engage in healthy conflict often finds themselves taken advantage of their boundaries, crossed their needs consistently ignored. They become what therapists call conflict avoidant, someone who will endure almost anything rather than risk confrontation. Jung's concept of individuation requires what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold tension between opposites until a third way emerges. In the case of peace and conflict, this might look like learning to address problems calmly but directly, to set boundaries with compassion but firmness, to disagree without attacking. The integration of this shadow involves developing what psychologists call assertiveness skills, the ability to express your needs, preferences, and boundaries clearly and directly without aggression or passive aggression. This is often terrifying for people who have equated any form of self-assertion with selfishness or violence. The process requires what trauma therapists call somatic work, learning to recognize the physical sensations that arise when you need to set a boundary or address a problem, and developing the capacity to move toward these sensations rather than away from them. Your body often knows what needs to be said before your mind catches up. The eighth shadow appears in what we might call the savior addiction, the compulsive need to rescue others as a way of avoiding your own healing work. This pattern is particularly seductive because it's socially praised and spiritually rationalized. The person who's always helping others appears generous, evolved, and selfless. But beneath this altruistic facade often lies what psychologists call codependency, a relationship pattern where your sense of worth becomes dependent on being needed by others. This addiction to saving others typically develops from childhood, experiences where you learned that your value was tied to your usefulness. Perhaps you had a parent who was chronically depressed, addicted, or overwhelmed, and you discovered that helping them was the only way to receive attention and connection. Maybe you grew up in a chaotic household where you became the family mediator, the one who kept everyone together through your own self-sacrifice. The child who learns to find identity through rescuing others becomes an adult who unconsciously seeks out relationships with people who need fixing. They're drawn to the emotionally unavailable, the chronically struggling, the perpetually dramatic, not because they enjoy chaos, but because these relationships activate familiar neural pathways that equate love with struggle, connection with sacrifice. The shadow of this pattern is that it often prevents both you and the people you're trying to help from genuine growth. When you consistently rescue others from the natural consequences of their choices, you're not helping them develop resilience, problem-solving skills, or emotional maturity. You're enabling their dependence while feeding your own need to feel indispensable. Jung understood that this dynamic represents what he called projection, unconsciously attributing aspects of yourself to others. The person who compulsively rescues others is often avoiding their own need for healing, their own vulnerability, their own unresolved trauma. It's easier to focus on fixing others than to face the difficult work of self-integration. This pattern is particularly common among people who work in helping professions, therapists, nurses, social workers, teachers, who might have unconsciously chosen careers that allow them to continue childhood patterns of caretaking. The profession becomes a socially acceptable way to avoid dealing with their own psychological material. The integration of this shadow requires what recovery programs call detachment with love, learning to care about others without taking responsibility for their choices or outcomes. This involves developing what boundaries experts call emotional differentiation, the ability to distinguish between your feelings and others' feelings, your problems and others' problems, your healing work and others' healing work. This process often involves grieving the fantasy of being able to save others, accepting the reality that everyone must do their own psychological work, and finding new sources of meaning and identity that don't depend on being needed. It requires developing what psychologists call healthy narcissism, an appropriate level of self-focus that allows you to attend to your own needs and development. The ninth shadow emerges from what we might call martyrdom as identity, the way that suffering can become so central to your sense of self that you unconsciously resist healing and happiness. This pattern is often deeply unconscious and highly defended because it challenges the very foundation of how you understand yourself and your place in the world. The martyrdom complex typically develops from childhood experiences where suffering was the primary way to receive attention, care or recognition. Perhaps you had parents who were only emotionally available when you were sick or struggling. Maybe you grew up in a family system where suffering was glorified, where the person who sacrificed the most was considered the most virtuous. Religious and cultural conditioning often reinforce this pattern by presenting suffering as spiritually meaningful, by suggesting that those who suffer the most are closest to God, by implying that ease and pleasure are somehow less spiritual than struggle and sacrifice. This creates what psychologists call suffering sanctification, the unconscious belief that pain gives life meaning and purpose. The shadow of martyrdom is that it creates what Jung called a complex, an autonomous psychological structure that operates independently of conscious will. The martyrdom complex actively seeks out situations that confirm your identity as someone who suffers, who sacrifices, who bears the burdens that others cannot carry. It will sabotage opportunities for joy, success, or ease because these states threaten your fundamental sense of identity. This shows up as unconsciously creating drama when life becomes too peaceful, pushing away support when it's offered, refusing help even when you desperately need it, and feeling anxious or guilty when things are going well. The martyrdom complex whispers that if you're not suffering, you must be doing something wrong, that ease means you're not trying hard enough, that happiness is somehow selfish or spiritually immature. Jung understood that this pattern represents what he called identification with the archetype, becoming so merged with a particular psychological pattern that you lose touch with your individual humanity. The martyr archetype serves important functions in human psychology and culture, but when you become identified with it, you lose access to other aspects of your personality and potential. The integration of this shadow requires what existential therapists call meaning-making, consciously choosing sources of purpose and identity that don't require your suffering. This might involve discovering that you can be valuable without being victimized, that you can contribute to others, without sacrificing yourself, that your worth isn't dependent on how much you can endure. This process often involves what trauma therapists call survivor guilt, the uncomfortable realization that you can be happy while others are suffering, that you can heal while others remain wounded, that you can thrive without feeling guilty about your good fortune. Learning to tolerate this guilt without returning to familiar patterns of self-sacrifice is crucial for genuine recovery. The integration also requires developing what positive psychologists call hedonic flexibility, the ability to experience pleasure, joy, and ease without immediately feeling the need to balance them with suffering. This might involve simple practices, like allowing yourself to enjoy a meal without guilt, accepting compliments without deflection, or celebrating achievements without immediately focusing on what's still wrong. The 10th and perhaps most profound shadow cast by unexamined goodness is what we might call the terror of being seen as bad, the deepest fear that drives much of the people-pleasing, overgiving, and self-erasure that characterizes the spiritually wounded. This isn't just about wanting to be liked, it's an existential terror of being rejected, abandoned, or cast out from the human community. This terror often has its roots in what developmental psychologists call attachment trauma, early experiences that taught you that love was conditional on being good, that connection required perfect behavior, that any expression of your authentic self might result in abandonment. The child who learns that their survival depends on being acceptable develops an adult who cannot tolerate the possibility of being seen as flawed, selfish, or difficult. The shadow of this terror is that it creates what Jung called inflation, an unconscious identification with only the positive aspects of your personality, while projecting all negative qualities onto others. You become unable to acknowledge your own capacity for selfishness, anger, manipulation, or harm, because doing so threatens your fundamental sense of safety and identity. This creates what psychologists call splitting, a psychological defense where people and situations are seen as either all good or all bad, with no room for the complexity and ambiguity that characterizes actual human experience. You might find yourself idealizing some people while demonizing others, unable to see that everyone contains multitudes, that goodness and badness often coexist in the same person. The terror of being bad also creates what therapists call emotional perfectionism, the belief that having negative emotions makes you a bad person. You might find yourself immediately apologizing for feeling angry, ashamed for feeling sad, or guilty for feeling frustrated. You've learned to equate emotional authenticity with moral failure. Jung's process of individuation requires what he called shadow integration, consciously acknowledging and accepting the aspects of yourself that you've deemed unacceptable. This doesn't mean acting on every impulse or abandoning ethical behavior, but it does mean recognizing that you, like every human being, contain the full spectrum of human possibility. The integration process often begins with what therapists call parts work, recognizing that you contain multiple aspects, some of which might seem contradictory. You might have a part that genuinely wants to help others, and another part that resents always being the one who gives. You might have a part that values harmony, and another part that wants to fight for what's right. These aren't contradictions to be resolved, but complexities to be integrated. Shadow integration also requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold tension between opposites without immediately resolving them into a more comfortable narrative. This might mean acknowledging that you can be both kind and cruel, generous and selfish, wise and foolish, often within the same day or even the same moment. The most profound realization in this process is understanding that your capacity for badness doesn't negate your goodness. It makes your goodness more authentic and powerful. When you choose kindness while knowing you're capable of cruelty, when you choose generosity while acknowledging your selfishness, when you choose love, while recognizing your capacity for harm, your choices become conscious rather than compulsive. This integration creates what Jung called the self, a psychological wholeness that includes but transcends the ego's need to be seen as good. From this place, your actions arise from genuine choice rather than unconscious compulsion, from authentic values rather than fear-based programming, from love rather than the terror of being unloved. The process of shadow integration is not comfortable or quick. It requires what Jung called the night sea journey, a descent into the unconscious depths where your disowned aspects have been waiting in the darkness. This journey can involve periods of depression, anxiety, confusion, and what mystics have called the dark night of the soul. But it's through this darkness that you discover not just your capacity for harm, but also your authentic capacity for good. The person who has integrated their shadow doesn't become selfish or harmful. They become more genuinely helpful because their help comes from choice rather than compulsion, from abundance rather than need, from love rather than fear. They can set boundaries without guilt because they know that healthy boundaries serve everyone. They can say no without anxiety because they understand that authentic no's make authentic yeses possible. They can engage in conflict when necessary because they're not terrified of being seen as difficult. They can receive help and support because they don't need to maintain an image of having it all together. They can be human, gloriously, messily, authentically human, without apologizing for taking up space in the world. Jung understood that the goal of psychological development isn't to become perfect, but to become whole. Wholeness includes your light and your darkness, your goodness and your capacity for harm, your wisdom and your foolishness. It's from this place of integration that genuine compassion emerges, not the compulsive helping that comes from unhealed wounds, but the conscious choice to serve life from a place of inner abundance. This is the paradox of shadow work. By acknowledging your capacity for badness, you become more genuinely good. By accepting your selfishness, you become more authentically generous. By integrating your darkness, you access your true light. This, isn't the artificial light of spiritual bypassing or people-pleasing, but the organic radiance that emerges from psychological wholeness. The 11th shadow emerges from what we might call inherited moral trauma. The way that religious, cultural, and familial conditioning around sin, shame, and sacrifice continues to operate in your unconscious long after you've intellectually rejected these belief systems. Even if you consider yourself spiritual rather than religious, even if you've done years of therapy, even if you intellectually understand that guilt and shame are not spiritually productive, these ancient patterns might still be running your emotional and energetic system. This moral trauma often manifests as what psychologists call religious trauma syndrome, a collection of symptoms that result from growing up in environments where love was conditional on moral performance, where natural human impulses were labeled as sinful, where your worth was determined by your ability to suppress your authentic desires in service of external expectations. The shadow of this pattern is that it creates what Jung called moral inflation, an unconscious identification with being good that requires the projection of badness onto others. You become unable to tolerate moral ambiguity in yourself while being hypercritical of others' ethical lapses. This creates a kind of spiritual perfectionism that is exhausting to maintain and impossible to satisfy. Even if you've consciously rejected the religious framework of your childhood, the emotional and somatic patterns it created might still be active. Your nervous system might still react to pleasure with guilt, to success with fear of punishment, to desire with shame. These aren't intellectual positions, but embodied responses that were conditioned into your system before you had the cognitive capacity to question them. This shows up as difficulty receiving compliments without deflection, inability to enjoy, success without immediately focusing on what's still wrong, and a persistent sense that if things are going well, something bad must be about to happen. Your unconscious is still operating from a belief system that equates goodness with suffering and pleasure with spiritual danger. The integration of this shadow requires what trauma therapists call somatic deprogramming, consciously rewiring your nervous system's responses to pleasure, success, and desire. This might involve practices like allowing yourself to receive a compliment without immediately deflecting it, celebrating achievements without qualifying them, or experiencing pleasure without guilt. Jung understood that true spiritual development requires what he called moral relativism, not the abandonment of ethics, but the recognition that moral frameworks are human constructions that serve psychological and social functions rather than absolute truths. This allows you to choose your values consciously rather than living unconsciously within inherited belief systems that might not serve your authentic development. The 12th and final shadow, cast by unexamined goodness, is what we might call control disguised as surrender, the way that spiritual concepts can become sophisticated mechanisms for avoiding genuine vulnerability and uncertainty. You might speak about letting go while gripping tightly to spiritual practices that give you a sense of control over your experience. You might talk about trust while refusing to enter situations where you can't predict or manage the outcome. This pseudo-surrender often manifests as spiritual bypassing of practical realities, using meditation to avoid taking action, using the concept of divine timing to justify procrastination, using ideas about acceptance to avoid addressing problems that require intervention. The person caught in this pattern appears spiritually advanced, but often struggles with basic life management and authentic intimacy. True surrender, as understood by mystics like Alan Watts and practical philosophers like Jung, isn't passive acceptance, but active engagement with uncertainty. It's the willingness to act without guarantees to love, without insurance policies to be vulnerable without safety nets. It's what Watts called the wisdom of insecurity, recognizing that the attempt to control outcomes is often what creates the suffering we're trying to avoid. The shadow of spiritual control is that it keeps you in what psychologists call fantasy rather than reality. You're relating to your idea of how life should be, rather than engaging with how life actually is. This creates a kind of spiritual dissociation, where you're always one step removed from direct experience, always filtering reality through concepts rather than meeting it immediately. The integration of this shadow requires what existential philosophers call anxiety tolerance, the ability to act in the face of uncertainty, to make choices without complete information, to commit to relationships and projects that might not work out as planned. This is perhaps the most mature spiritual practice, showing up fully for life even when you can't control the outcomes. As we reach the end of this journey through the shadows cast by unexamined goodness, it's important to understand that this isn't a condemnation of kindness, empathy, or spiritual aspiration. These are beautiful and necessary human capacities. The invitation is to examine whether your goodness is coming from authentic choice or unconscious compulsion, from love or from fear, from wholeness or from woundedness. Jung's concept of individuation suggests that the goal isn't to become good or bad, but to become conscious, aware of your motivations, honest about your shadows, and capable of choosing your responses rather than being unconsciously driven by unexamined patterns. This consciousness allows your goodness to become more authentic, your empathy to become more boundaried, and your spirituality to become more grounded in reality. The person who has done this work doesn't abandon kindness, but discovers a kindness that includes the courage to disappoint others when necessary, to set boundaries when appropriate, and to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable. They don't become selfish, but develop what Jung called enlightened self-interest, the recognition that taking care of yourself ultimately serves everyone because it allows you to show up more authentically and sustainably in relationships. They don't abandon spirituality, but develop what we might call psychological spirituality, practices and beliefs that honor both transcendent possibilities and human realities that include both light and shadow, that embrace both the desire for a connection with something greater and the need for healthy individuation. This integration creates what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox without immediately resolving it into comfortable categories. You can be both spiritual and practical, both kind and boundaried, both accepting and action-oriented. You become what the mystics called a both-and person rather than an either-or person. Perhaps most importantly, this work allows you to discover what genuine rest feels like. Not the exhausted collapse that comes from people, pleasing and overgiving, but the organic ease that emerges when you're no longer fighting against yourself. When you're not constantly managing your image, monitoring others' reactions, or suppressing your authentic responses, you free up enormous amounts of energy that can be redirected toward creativity, genuine service, and authentic connection. The shadows we've explored tonight aren't enemies to be defeated, but aspects of yourself to be understood and integrated. Each shadow contains not just the seeds of suffering, but also the potential for greater authenticity, deeper compassion, and more genuine spiritual development. The rage you've been suppressing might contain the energy you need to create necessary changes. The selfishness you've been avoiding might contain the self-care that would allow you to serve others more sustainably. The boundaries you've been afraid to set might create the space needed for genuine intimacy. The truth you've been avoiding might be the key to relationships based on authenticity rather than performance. The darkness you've been rejecting might contain the very medicine your soul has been seeking. This is the profound paradox of shadow work. By becoming willing to be seen as bad, you discover your authentic goodness. By accepting your capacity for selfishness, you access genuine generosity. By integrating your darkness, you claim your light. Not the artificial light of spiritual performance, but the organic radiance that emerges from psychological wholeness. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, consider setting aside the exhausting work of being good enough, spiritual enough, selfless enough to earn your place in the world. Consider the possibility that you already belong, that your worth isn't dependent on your performance, that your value isn't determined by how little trouble you cause or how much you give. Consider the possibility that your authentic self, shadows and all, is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be unwrapped, not a burden to be carried, but a treasure to be discovered. Consider that the very aspects of yourself you've been trying to heal, fix, or transcend might be the keys to your liberation. As Carl Jung reminded us, your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens. Tonight you're awakening not just to your light but to your wholeness, not just to your goodness but to your humanity, not just to who you think you should be, but to who you actually are. Write in the comments, "I choose my wholeness." Let's see. How many are ready for this kind of integration? This kind of authentic spiritual development that includes rather than transcends our beautiful, messy, complex humanity. For our next journey together, tell me what else you would like to be explored. The most liked comments will likely become future explorations into the depths of psychological and spiritual integration. Until then, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, you don't have to be perfect to be whole, and you don't have to be good to be loved. You just have to be willing to be authentically, courageously, unapologetically yourself.